On a Friday evening in early 2026, in front of a studio audience that skews liberal, educated, and overwhelmingly sympathetic to the kind of progressive causes Meghan Markle has spent the better part of 5 years positioning herself as the embodiment of, Maher made a joke about the Duchess of Sussex. The audience did not shift uncomfortably in their seats. They did not offer the cautious, uncertain laughter of people unsure whether they were being invited to laugh at something they should be defending. They erupted, fully, immediately, and with the particular enthusiasm of people who had been waiting for permission to find something funny that they had privately been finding absurd for considerably longer than their public positioning had allowed them to admit. The laughter lasted longer than the joke. It always does when a comedian has not simply written a punchline, but accurately diagnosed something that an audience has been carrying without quite knowing how to put it down. And in that extended, released, genuinely delighted laughter, something shifted in the cultural weather surrounding Meghan Markle in a way that no Sussex communications strategy, no carefully timed lifestyle brand announcement, and no sympathetically produced documentary series was going to be able to reverse. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you enjoy these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you definitely don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and helps you stay up to date as every new royal moment unfolds. And while you're here, let us know, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see viewers joining us from all around the world. To understand why that moment carried the weight it did, one must first understand who Maher is and who his audience is, because both matter enormously to the significance of what happened. Maher is not a British tabloid columnist nursing a decades-long institutional grievance against a woman who dared to challenge the monarchy. He is not a palace-adjacent commentator protecting establishment interests from the threat of an outsider's transparency. He is one of America's most watched, most analytically precise, and most culturally influential political comedians, a man who has built a 30-year career on the specific skill of identifying exactly where public figures' stated values and actual behavior diverge, and then illuminating that divergence in terms so accurate that the laughter they generate feels less like mockery and more like collective recognition. His audience is not the audience Meghan's critics are supposed to come from. They are her people, or they were supposed to be, liberal, coastal, culturally progressive, instinctively sympathetic to stories about institutional power being challenged by individuals willing to sacrifice comfort for truth. When that audience laughs at Meghan Markle, something has gone wrong with the brand in a place where the brand was supposed to be safest. What Maher targeted was not her race, not her background, not the legitimate grievances about press treatment that formed the emotional foundation of her departure from royal life. He targeted the contradictions, and the contradictions, laid out with the efficiency that great comedy demands, are considerable. Here is a woman who told the world she was leaving the royal family to escape the suffocating scrutiny of institutional life, and who marked that departure by granting a globally televised interview to the world's single most watched interviewer, watched by an estimated 49 million people. A woman who built an entire public identity around the claim that she valued privacy and authenticity, and who has since launched a podcast, a Netflix documentary series, a lifestyle brand, a production company, and a charitable foundation, each one trailing a press release and a carefully curated set of images designed for maximum media impact. A woman who positioned herself as a truth-teller, willing to speak uncomfortable realities to powerful institutions, and who has responded to scrutiny of her own claims with the particular combination of silence, legal letters, and accusations of bad faith that powerful institutions have deployed against truth-tellers for generations. These are not invented contradictions. They are the public record. And Maher, with the receipts that great comedy requires, laid them out in terms that made the laughter not cruel, but inevitable. The specific observations that drew the longest and most sustained responses from his audience that evening touched something that polling data and cultural commentary had been circling for months without quite landing on directly. The Opera interview's most dramatic claims, delivered with absolute emotional conviction to a global audience, have since been complicated by subsequent reporting in ways that the interview's defenders have struggled to address without abandoning the interview's central premises entirely. The Archetypes podcast, launched with the full weight of a Spotify deal reportedly worth tens of millions of dollars, lasted one season before the partnership ended in circumstances that neither party has described with any clarity. The American Riviera Orchard lifestyle brand launched in the spring of 2024 with a carefully orchestrated campaign of celebrity jam deliveries and aspirational imagery, and has since generated considerably more questions about its commercial substance than products available for public purchase. Each of these data points individually is explicable. Together, they describe a pattern that Maher identified with the precision of a diagnostician rather than a critic. The pattern of a brand that is consistently more impressive in its announcement than in its execution, more compelling as a concept than as a delivered reality, more interested in the story of what it is becoming than in the evidence of what it has actually become. The eruption of laughter that followed was not the sound of cruelty. It was the sound of recognition arriving, finally, in a room where it had been kept waiting at the door for far too long. The difference between a roast that lands and a roast that merely offends is not the sharpness of the material. It is the accuracy an audience can sense with the particular instinct that crowds develop in real time, whether a joke is constructed from genuine observation or from the desire to wound. The first produces laughter that feels like release. The second produces a discomfort that no amount of applause can fully disguise. What made Maher's dissection of Meghan Markle so effective? What separated it from the years of tabloid criticism that her defenders had correctly identified as motivated, disproportionate, and in certain cases demonstrably prejudiced, was that every observation he made came with something the tabloid coverage rarely bothered to provide: evidence, not insinuation, not anonymous briefing, not the carefully placed negative story traceable to a palace source with an institutional axe to grind. Documented, publicly available, verifiable evidence that the gap between Meghan's self-presentation and her actual record was not a media construction, but a pattern visible to anyone willing to examine the public record without the protective filter of prior commitment to a particular conclusion. Begin with the Opera interview because Maher did, and because it remains the single most consequential moment in the Sussex public narrative, the foundation on which everything that followed was built, and the structure whose integrity, once questioned, destabilizes everything constructed on top of it. The interview aired in March 2021 and was watched by an estimated 49 million people globally. It contained claims of institutional racism at the highest level of the British monarchy, allegations of deliberate indifference to suicidal ideation, and a portrait of two people so thoroughly failed by an institution they had served that departure had become not a choice, but a survival necessity. The emotional power of those claims was undeniable, and their impact on public opinion was immediate and significant. What Maher identified, with the precision that 5 years of subsequent reporting had made available, was the accumulation of complications. The specific claim about a conversation regarding Archie's skin color, later addressed by the palace in terms that contradicted the interview's framing, was never formally substantiated. The mental health claims, delivered with absolute conviction, were later complicated by accounts from palace staff and family members whose version of events the Sussexes' narrative had no mechanism for accommodating. Maher's point was not that the interview was entirely fabricated. His point was that it was presented with a certainty that the available evidence did not fully support, and that the unwillingness to acknowledge any complexity in that evidence was itself a form of the institutional behavior Meghan claimed to be exposing. Then there is the commercial record, which Maher examined with the particular relish of someone who understands that in America, where Meghan has chosen to build her post-royal life, the market is the most honest critic available. The Spotify deal, reportedly worth between $15 and $20 million, produced one season of Archetypes before the partnership concluded. Spotify's head of podcast innovation, in a comment that circulated widely, described the situation in terms that were not entirely consistent with the Sussex team's characterization of a mutually satisfying creative conclusion. The Netflix documentary series, according to sources inside the streaming platform who spoke to multiple outlets, required considerably more editorial intervention before broadcast than the production's initial vision had anticipated. The American Riviera Orchard brand, launched with a celebrity jam distribution campaign that generated extraordinary media coverage and genuine consumer interest, has since struggled to translate that interest into a commercially coherent product offering available for public purchase at scale. Each of these outcomes, Maher observed, shares a structural feature. The announcement is always more fully realized than the delivery, the concept always more compelling than the execution. The story of what is being built always more present than the evidence of what has been built. What made the audience's response so revealing was not simply that they laughed, but that they laughed without apparent guilt. The social permission structure that had previously made criticism of Meghan Markle costly in progressive cultural spaces, the rapid deployment of accusations of racism and misogyny against anyone who questioned her claims or examined her record, had been quietly eroding for months before Maher named the erosion publicly. His roast did not create the shift in his audience's perception. It confirmed a shift that had already occurred and gave it the social permission of communal laughter. Once an audience has laughed together at something, the individual cost of having found it funny disappears into the collective. And once that cost disappears, the questions that the laughter represents cannot easily be repackaged as prejudice. Maher understood this mechanism precisely. It is the mechanism he has deployed throughout his career against targets across the political spectrum. And against Meghan Markle, it worked with a completeness that suggested the material had been waiting for exactly this delivery. The defenders responded, as they always do, with accusations of motivation. Maher was punching down. Maher was participating in a coordinated campaign. Maher was giving cover to people whose criticism of Meghan was rooted in something uglier than comedic observation. These arguments were made with genuine conviction by people who hold them sincerely, but they failed to gain the traction their advocates expected. And the reason they failed is the reason every defense fails when the offense has come equipped with receipts. You cannot argue with the Spotify numbers. You cannot reframe the jam. Hollywood has a particular relationship with authenticity that outsiders consistently underestimate. It is an industry built on performance, on constructed narrative, on the careful management of public perception at industrial scale. And yet it is also an industry with a finely calibrated internal censor for the difference between someone who has a genuine story and someone who is performing the having of one. That censor is not moral, it is commercial. Hollywood does not care whether you are telling the truth. It cares whether the audience will eventually notice that you are not. And the audience, in Hollywood's long experience, always eventually notices. Meghan Markle arrived in Los Angeles in 2020 with what should have been, by any commercial assessment, an extraordinary asset: a royal story, a race story, an institutional betrayal story. Three of the most commercially powerful narrative categories in contemporary entertainment, combined in a single figure with genuine charisma, legitimate grievances, and the kind of origin mythology that development executives spend careers trying to manufacture. The question was never whether the story was sellable. The question, the one Hollywood's internal censor was quietly asking from the beginning, was whether there was enough behind the story to sustain a career built on telling it. 5 years later, that question has an answer, and the answer is what Bill Maher's audience was laughing at. The arc of American public opinion toward Meghan did not shift because of British tabloid influence penetrating American media. American audiences are considerably less susceptible to that influence than British commentators typically assume. It did not shift because of palace briefings or royal institutional pressure applied through transatlantic back channels. It shifted because of the accumulation of a specific kind of evidence that American audiences, and Hollywood specifically, process with unsentimental efficiency, the evidence of projects that do not fully deliver on their premise. The Spotify podcast lasted 1 season. The Netflix documentary required significant intervention. The lifestyle brand has generated more coverage of its launch than commerce from its operation. The production company has announced projects whose development timelines have stretched in ways that the initial announcements did not anticipate. None of these individual outcomes is fatal. All of them together describe a pattern, and patterns, in Hollywood's commercial language, are the only biography that ultimately matters. The Whisper Network in Los Angeles, that informal but remarkably efficient circulation of professional assessment that operates beneath the level of published criticism, began carrying a consistent message about the Sussex project sometime in 2023. The message was not about race or politics or the rights and wrongs of leaving the royal family. It was about the gap between concept and execution that kept appearing in every project regardless of its subject matter or format. Sources inside the entertainment industry who have worked in proximity to Sussex productions describe a creative environment in which the personal narrative always threatens to overwhelm the project it is supposed to be serving, in which the story of Meghan having a story becomes more present in the room than the story itself. That is a specific and recognizable creative problem in Hollywood, and it is one that no amount of charisma, institutional backing, or commercially powerful origin mythology can substitute for solving. The benefit of the doubt that American audiences extended generously and sincerely in the aftermath of the Oprah interview was not withdrawn maliciously. It was withdrawn the way all creative credit is eventually withdrawn in an industry that runs on delivery. Gradually, then suddenly, and always in response to the same question: where is the work that justifies the story being told about the work? Harry's position throughout this period has added a dimension to the public perception of the Sussex brand that its architects did not anticipate and have not successfully managed. He has become, in the American cultural imagination, a figure whose sympathy operates independently of, and sometimes in direct tension with, his wife's public positioning. His visible receding from the double act the brand once required, the solo appearances, the quietly separate engagements, the body language that the internet's forensic attention has documented with obsessive thoroughness, has introduced a narrative the Sussex communications infrastructure has no clean response to. The image of a man who gave up everything for story he is no longer entirely present inside is not a story Meghan's brand can accommodate without fundamentally restructuring the premises on which it was built. And restructuring those premises would require acknowledging complications that the brand's survival has always depended on not acknowledging. Maher saw all of this. His audience saw all of this. The laughter was not the sound of people deciding to be cruel. It was the sound of people who had been extending generosity on credit, finally acknowledging that the invoice had come due and the payment was not arriving. There is a moment after great comedy when the laughter fades and what remains in the room is something considerably more serious than what the joke itself contained. The audience at Real Time with Bill Maher experienced that moment. The laughter at Meghan Markle's expense was genuine and immediate and fully earned by the material that produced it. But what settled over the room when it subsided was not the lightness that follows a joke that has simply been funny. It was the particular weight of a conversation that has been waiting to happen for a long time and has finally, through the unlikely vehicle of a Friday night comedy program, been granted permission to begin. That permission, once granted, does not expire. And the questions it unleashed are not questions that a lifestyle brand relaunch or a carefully timed charitable announcement or a sympathetically produced profile in a progressive publication can answer or redirect or make go away. The commercial reckoning is the most concrete and the least deniable. American Riviera Orchard exists as a brand architecture, a logo, a carefully curated aesthetic, a set of celebrity associations activated with considerable skill during its launch period. What it has not consistently produced is the commercial substance that brand architecture is supposed to house. The products that were announced have arrived slowly and incompletely. The retail partnerships that the launch implied have not materialized at the scale the launch suggested. The gap between the brand's self-presentation and its commercial reality is not a gap that sympathetic coverage can indefinitely bridge, because at some point the consumer, like the comedy audience, applies the same unsentimental test. Where is the thing you said you were making? The production company faces a version of the same question. Projects announced with the full weight of Netflix infrastructure and Sussex brand recognition have moved through development on timelines that suggest the creative challenges involved are more substantial than the announcement press releases anticipated. Hollywood does not punish ambition. It punishes the consistent substitution of announcement for delivery. And the substitution has been consistent enough now to constitute a pattern that the industry's internal assessment has quietly but definitively registered. The palace's response to the Maher moment was the response it has learned through years of costly engagement with Sussex narratives is the most effective one available. Silence. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of an institution that has understood something important about the dynamics of this particular conflict. That engagement costs more than it gains. That patience, applied with discipline, is a more powerful instrument than retaliation. But the most devastating thing the palace can do to a narrative built on the claim of institutional persecution is to simply decline to persecute. Every time the palace says nothing, the Sussex brand's most commercially essential story, the story of two people silenced and marginalized by a powerful institution, becomes slightly harder to sustain. The silence is not kind. It is strategic, and it is working with a completeness that no formal response could have achieved. What Maher's roast ultimately revealed, beneath the laughter and the receipts and the surgical identification of every gap between promise and delivery, was a question about what comes next. A brand built entirely on a single story has a structural vulnerability that brands built on consistent output do not share. The story has a natural endpoint. The institution it was built against has declined to provide the ongoing persecution that would extend that story indefinitely. The audience that was supposed to be its permanent base has begun applying the scrutiny it extends to every public figure who asks for its sustained attention. And the work that was supposed to demonstrate that the story was a beginning rather than an entirety has not yet arrived in sufficient quantity or quality to answer that application of scrutiny convincingly. The punchline Bill Maher delivered was not about Meghan Markle's character or her legitimate grievances or the real costs of the choices she has made. It was about the distance between the story and the substance. And that distance, measured in cancelled podcasts and delayed product launches and a husband whose sympathies increasingly appear to operate on a separate frequency, is the only number that matters now.